in the heart of the 8th century on a solitary, jagged peak rising abruptly from the freezing swells of the North Atlantic ocean, priceless. Mice's masterpiece of human civilization was slowly being brought to life in the profound silence of winter nights. The magnificent illuminated pages of the ancient manuscript, the Book of Kells, were not merely written, heart ink, but were meticulously engineered through the thousands of miles of perilous trade routes that carried lapis lazuli and the closely guarded secrets of gold illumination. All the impined preserve the summit of human knowledge from the impending, scorched earth raids of the Viking longships. Hello, my friend, and welcome back to this quiet space. Take a moment to adjust your pillow, pull that warm blanket just a little closer to your shoulders, and allow your mind to drift away from the modern world. Tonight we are stepping backward through the corridors of time to the year Bar Common Era, inside the 3-foot-thick dry stone walls of Skellig Michael Monastery. Skellig Michael Monastery, off the coast of Ireland, where an elder monk is preparing the raw materials for his nightly labour. This work demands absolute stillness, a sublime union of ancient alchemy and enduring faith where every micro-movement of the hands carries a profound weight. Before we submerge our thoughts deeper into this cloistered world of sacred pigment and gold comfort, to remind you that this narrative is a creative historical work constructed for your relaxation and education. While every detail is firmly rooted in verified archival history, certain atmospheres, reimagined quiet settings, have been textually reimagined by our team to provide a deeply immersive auditory experience for your night. This content has been carefully developed with the assistance of meticulously reviewed, verified and edited by the dedicated editorial team here at Whispers of Centuries. Reset Whispers of Candaisharth. Now, as the tallow candle begins to cast its soft golden glow across the workspace, and the faint rustic aroma of melting beef fat fills the stone chamber, allow the muscles in your face to loosen. Completely let your breathing settle into the rhythmic cadence of the ocean waves, crashing far below the cliffs, and let us begin our journey into the quiet craft of the past. The geographical isolation of Skellig Michael was a deliberate choice of defence and extreme asceticism dictated by the offence of the 8th-century maritime world. This jagged pinnacle of dark Devonian sandstone loomed 600 feet above the Atlantic waves, situated the southern coast of Ireland, coast citadel, making it a formidable natural citadel. The monks engineered their lives atop this precipice, precisely because its sheer vertical currents provided a vital psychological and physical barrier against external threats. During this turbulent era, the northern horizons were increasingly darkened by the threat of Scandinavians could easily navigate shallow raiders, whose shallow draft longships could easily navigate shallow rivers but struggled against the treacherous, deceptive swells surrounding this isolated rock. To reach the scriptorium where the sacred knowledge was being preserved, would have to navigate over 600 uneven steps, hand-carved directly into the sheer, stone face of the cliffside, often slick with freezing sea spray and obscured by dense low-hanging fog. This vertical labyrinth meant could be spotted hours in diameter before it could land, providing the community with critical time to conceal their developing manuscripts. This Cummings Dall Srant within dry stone caches beneath the monastery floors. The walls of the scriptorium itself were a marvel of early medieval dry stone engineering constructed with a precise technique called corbellings, or each layer of flat sandstone was laid slightly inward as the wall rose, creating a sturdy beehive shape that naturally deflected the fierce bank gales outward and downward rather than absorbing their crushing impact. These massive stone barriers measured nearly 3 feet in thickness, ensuring that while a catastrophic open storm, the interior of the chamber remained absolutely static, unmoving, and impervious to the damp predatory winds that could easily ruin fragile parchment. Inside this fortified sanctuary, the air carried a heavy mineral stillness, where the external world was reduced to a distant rhythmic thud of waves, striking the base of the island, an ancient immutable heartbeat that served as the metronome for the monk's slow, deliberate labour. The physical architecture of the scriptorium on Skellig Michael was specifically engineered elements available on this desolate rock, while protecting the vulnerable materials of illumination. The small windows of the chamber were not expansive openings, but narrow diagonal slits slanting sharply through the 3-foot stone walls, designed to capture and diffuse the weak northern daylight without allowing the turbulent wind to enter. These apertures were covered with thin oiled animal bladders that emitted a pale translucent glow while completely sealing the interior against the salty sea sprays. Warp the delicate vellum pages. In the deep hours of the night when the daylight had entirely vanished, the monks relied on ancient methods of illumination using tallow candles moulded from rendered beef fat, which produced a heavy, thick light and a distinct rustic aroma that filled the stone room. To prevent the ink from freezing and the hands of the scribe from stiffening in the profound sub-zero temperatures of the winter ocean, the monks utilized a primitive but effective subfloor heating system where charcoal embers generated from scrub oak were placed in iron braziers beneath the stone flagging. This gentle, radiant warmth did not create drafts that could disturb the loose pigments, but maintained a steady, controlled temperature, just sufficient to keep the materials workable. If you are finding comfort in this slow journey, consider subscribing to Whispers of Centuries and leaving a gentle thumbs up to support our preservation. Mid-9 spinning of these peaceful historical narratives. The atmosphere within this space was one of absolute sensory focus, where the crackle of charcoal and the faint hiss of the tallow candle were the only sounds accompanying the monk as he prepared his tools. Every element of the scriptorium was arranged, verkepte at mathematical precision from the iron inkwells sunk into heavy blocks of wood to prevent tipping to the smooth beach, pebbles used to weight down the edges of the manuscripts. The monk sat upon a simple 3-legged stool carved from resilient ash wood, but held with a disciplined rigidity that had been perfected through years of silent service. The physical attire and conditioning of the insular scribe were as essential to the creation of the manuscript as the tools of the craft themselves. The monk wore a heavy cowl woven from raw coarse wool obtained from native sheep, which retained its natural lanolin, providing a water-resistant barrier against the persistent dampness of the Atlantic air. This garment was dyed a deep muted brown, using a decoction of dried roots and lichens scraped from the monastery rocks, which offered a grounding, earthy scent that mingled with the aroma of the tallow candle. Beneath this outer cloak he wore a linen tunic next to his skin, while a broad leather girdle was strapped tightly around his midsection, serving the dual purpose of keeping the core body heat trapped and supporting the lower back during the grueling hours of motionless labour. The hands of the scribe, though calloused from the physical demands of maintaining, were meticulously sustaining and dried before meticulously cleaned, and dried before touching a full destins for the Book of Kells. The fingers had developed a highly specialized dexterity, capable of executing microscopic adjustments in pressure, where even a fraction of a millimeter could alter the flow of the ink. The monk sat with his feet resting on a thick block of peat wood to insulate them from the freezing stone floor, allowing his circulation to remain steady, despite the profound chill of the room. Not every movement within this space was measured and deliberate, as any sudden agitation could create currents of air that might surf the fragile layers of gold-based the finely sifted gold, or displace the finely sifted mineral dust. The silence of the room was a palpable presence, a protective envelope that allowed to scribes see to the micro-textures of his craft, hearing the subtle resistance of the writing surface and feeling the precise weight of the instruments as an extension of his own physical form. The foundation of this monumental scribal endeavour rested entirely upon the quality of the vellum, which served as the canvas for the intricate insular illumination. This writing material was not modern paper, but a highly durable medium engineered from the skins of newborn calves. A choice dictated by the necessity for a smooth, non-porous surface that could withstand multiple layers of heavy pigment and gold leaf without tearing or warping over time. The process of creating this premium vellum began far from the scriptorium on the mainland pastures, where the animal hides were carefully selected for their lack of blemishes or insect bites. The raw skins were first soaked in a highly concentrated solution of slaked process that loosened the hair follicles and dissolved the unwanted fat tissue within the dermal layer. Once this soaking was complete, the skin was thoroughly rinsed in fresh running alkali before being stretched at immense hand frame, welcome back tension, upon a sturdy rectangular wooden frame, using adjustable wooden pegs. While under this state of extreme tension, a specialist took his unique crescent-shaped knife called a lunellum to meticulously scrape bare tear-hat sides of the skin. The curved blade was critical because a standard straight taut membrane weeks destroying of labour in a single fraction of a second. The artisan moved the lunellum at a precise 30-degree angle, paring away microscopic layers of flesh and hair until the skin reached a uniform thickness and attained a degree of light translucency. As the vellum dried on the frame under tension, its fibres reorganized into a highly stable crisscross pattern that locked the material into a state of permanent flatness, preventing it from returning to its original organic shape, even when subjected to the extreme humidity fluctuations of the Atlantic climate. The resulting sheets were then cut with a razor bifolia, each one presenting a smooth ivory-like surface that possessed a unique organic memory, ready to hold the bees' sacred text for more than 1,000 years. The physical anatomy of a single sheet of completed vellum presented two distinctly different surfaces that required the monk to possess an intimate understanding of organic textures before applying a single drop of ink. The outer surface, known technically as the hair side, retained a slightly darker cream or golden hue and bore the faint microscopic patterns of the animal follicles, which created a subtle natural grain that resisted the pen with a slight pleasant friction. In contrast, the interior surface, called the flesh side, was remarkably smooth, virtually white, and possessed a velvety softness that absorbed pigments with incredible speed and depth. The monk would carefully touch the surface with the back of his fingers, feeling the subtle variations in density, and ensuring that when the bifolia were folded to form the gatherings or quires of the book, the hair side always faced another hair side, and the flesh side faced a flesh side, to maintain visual and textural symmetry across every opening. This meticulous matching ensured that as the viewer turned the heavy pages, the transition between textures was completely imperceptible to the eye and the touch. It is worth remembering as you listen to these intricate details that while our narrative is constructed to bring the serene workshop into your night, it remains a work of creative historical interpretation. Designed specifically for relaxation and entertainment, every scene is carefully shaped from genuine medieval records and has been verified by the editorial team at Whispers of As You Rest. You are also connecting with the authentics. This truths of our shared human heritage. Now as the wind murmurs against the high stone corbels outside the room, the monk prepares to transition from the raw skin to the precious minerals that will bring the brilliant hues of the cosmos onto these pristine ivory surfaces. The creation of the iconic deep blue pigment used in the Book of Kells required an extraordinary understanding of mineralogy and a willingness to engage with materials that had travelled across the not known world. This specific hue was derived from lapis lazuli, an exceptionally rare metamorphic rock containing lazurite, which could only be sourced from the treacherous mountain mines of Badakhshan in modern-day Afghanistan. This mineral travelled thousands of miles along the hazardous overland routes of the Silk Road, passed through the bustling markets of Constantinople and across the Mediterranean, before finally reaching the isolated scriptorium of Skellig Michael. To transform this dense, semi-precious stone into a workable paint, the monk placed the raw chunks into a deep mortar carved from exceptionally hard green jade. He then utilized a heavy matching jade pestle to begin the grueling process of reduction, crushing the stone with slow, deliberate vertical strokes that echoed through the small stone chamber with a rhythmic metallic cadence. If you are enjoying this tranquil immersion into the specialized arts of the medieval world, please take a quiet moment to subscribe to Whispers of Centuries and leave a gentle thumbs up to support our peaceful educational content. The monk applied a steady, measured pressure, ensuring the jade pestle never struck the sides of the mortar too sharply. Verkep might introduce unwanted stone fragments into the mixture, as the heavy blue mineral was slowly fractured by the rhythmic impacts, before gradually breaking down into a fine gritty sand that released a subtle sulfuric odour reminiscent of ancient earth. This tedious manual reduction was carried out with the final pigment depended entirely on the uniformity of the particle size, ensuring that when the blue was le bleu eventually applied to the vellum, it would catch the golden candle light evenly without clumping. Once the lapis lazuli had been reduced to a fine sand, the monk initiated a complex purification process from toward vivid blue, lazurite from the dull grey calcite and glittering pyrite, impurities naturally embedded within the stone. This was not a simple matter of washing the dust in water, as the lighter impurities would remain suspended and turn the final paint into a muddy, greyish blue. Instead, the monk utilized a sophisticated chemical separation technique known to medieval alchemists, involving an organic paste made from melted beeswax mastic resin and pure pine rosin. This sticky compound was thoroughly kneaded with a dense uniform ball, which was then left to mature for several days in a dark corner of the room in below. When the mixture had properly set, the monk submerged the blue ceramic bowl, filled with a lukewarm, mildly alkaline solution derived from wood ashes. Using his fingertips with a slow, rhythmic, massaging motion, he worked the ball under the water. This physical agitation caused the finest particles of pure lazurite to detach themselves from the resin matrix, migrating into the surrounding liquid, while the unwanted calcite and iron pyrites remained trapped within the sticky wax. The water gradually transformed into a deep cloud of ultramarine blue, as intense and mesmerizing as the twilight sky. The monk then allowed the liquid to sit undisturbed for hours, letting the purified blue sediment slowly, carefully siphoning off the clear of the dish before carefully siphoning off the clear water. This sequence was repeated up to 3 times with each subsequent extraction, yielding a slightly lower grade of pigment, which was kept in separate small glazed earthenware pots, labelled according to its purity and depth of tone. The preparation of the ultimate binder was a delicate exercise in biochemistry, designed to ensure that the purified mineral pigments would adhere cracking to the vellum without cracking or flaking or under the damp maritime conditions of the monastery. For this purpose, the monk relied on a specialized organic emulsion crafted from the loke void-wild seabird egg during the early cliffs from these treacherous nesting ledges of the island cliffs. This egg yolk was highly prized because its natural lemmet structure provided an exceptional balance of flexibility and water resistance once dried. The monk carefully separated the yellow yolk from the clear white albumen by rolling it back and forth across a outer membrane was completely dry abdomen to gright, placed in linen cloth. He then punctured the delicate sac with a polished bone needle, allowing the rich tiny horn vial while discarding the tough outer skin. To this pure egg yolk the monk added a precise measure of clarified gall extracted from Atlantic cod, which had been boiled down to a thick, dark, syrupy consistency. This bitter additive acted as a natural surfactant, lowering the surface tension of the liquid and allowing the pigment particles to disperse and clumping the binder rather than clumping together. Furthermore, the chemical composition of the fish gall provided a powerful natural deterrent against microscoping on the organic proteins of the egg that would otherwise feed on the organic proteins of the egg over the centuries. The two substances were thoroughly blended together using a clean twig of seasoned haze the hands to avoid it slowly between the tiny air bubbles which could weaken the binding matrix and cloud the final transparency of the paint. The final amalgamation of the ultramarine pigment and the specialized organic binder required an exacting level of manual friction, carried out upon a large flat slab of polished red granite. The monk poured a small mound of the purified lapis lazuli dust, then used a hollow goose quill to drop a precise quantity of the egg and fish gall emulsion onto the mineral pile. Utilizing a heavy flat-bottomed glass muller shaped like a smooth mushroom together, using to grind the two components motion that produced a slow continuous figure 8 that produced a soft soothing hiss against the granite slab. If you are resting comfortably in this sanctuary of ancient knowledge, please consider subscribing to Whispers of Thumbs Up to support our video. A gentle thumbs up to serve our slow historical journeys. The physical friction generated by the muller broke down any remaining microscopic grain of lazurite, ensuring completely coated in a thin protective, the thin protectile jacket of the lipid binder. As the grinding progressed over the course of an hour, the texture of the mixture shifted dramatically from a coarse pasty slurry that possessed a deep lustrous sheen, not as a deep lustrous sheen. The monk monitored the viscosity by lifting the muller slightly and observing how the paint draped from the base achieved a smooth ribbon-like consistency. This fluid was then scraped from the granite slab using a thin flexible mussel shell and transferred as the traditional stable receptacle for holding a crystal stable receptacle for liquid pigments during the active painting process. The physical transformation of the dry mineral powder into a flowing liquid medium marked the beginning of its practical of vellum onto the prepared sheets of vellum. The monk carefully held the freshwater mussel shell, containing the fresh ultramarine paint, checking its weak flickering light of the tallow candle. The kindler kindle hall, when tilted slightly, the liquid moved with a heavy deliberate sluggishness, indicating that the ratio of lipid binder to mineral solute had achieved its optimal chemical equilibrium. Its optimal chemical equilibrium. This high density was critical, because if the natural capillary action of the porous animal fibers within the vellum would draw the fluid outward, causing the crisp borders of the illumination to blur into a soft formless shadow. To test the compound, the monk utilized a fine brush crafted from the delicate belly hairs of an island, ermine, bound tightly within the hollow shaft of a crow feather. He dipped the absolute tip of the brush into the blue pool, then applied a single trial stroke onto a small discarded scrap of vellum pinned to his desk. The pigment settled onto the ivory surface, without skipping or separating of blue, that immediately began to dry from a glossy wet matte sheen into a deep velvet matte finish. This specific shade of ultramarine possessed a unique optical quality that allowed it to absorb the red spectrum of the candlelight, appearing almost black in the shadows but bursting into a vivid celestial blue whenever a direct beam of light struck its surface. Satisfied with the chemical stability of his creation, the monk placed the mussel shell into a small hollowed-out depression on his wooden desktop, ensuring it remained perfectly level and protected from any stray drops of condensation that might drip from the cold stone vaulted ceiling above. The introduction of pure gold into the manuscript required a shift in methodology from chemical compounding to the delicate mechanical manipulation of precious weightus that were almost metal sheets that were almost weightless in their extreme thinness. The gold utilized by the monks of Skellig Michael was obtained from native alluvial deposits found in the gravel Irish mainland, where small nuggets were collected and transported. Small nuggets were caravaned on to monastic metalworkers. These artisans placed the refined gold between thick layers of greased animal hide and subjected it to hours of relentless rhythmic hammering with heavy iron mallets scaled until the metal was flattened into full sheets measuring less than a single micrometer in thickness. These sheets were so extraordinarily delicate that they could easily disintegrate into unrecoverable dust or exposed to the slightest movement of air within the scriptorium. The monk had to maintain an absolute state of physical stillness when opening the small leather pouch containing the gold leaf, ensuring his breathing could be directed completely away from the table. A single inadvertent exhalation could cause the entire sheet of gold to fold over on itself, or float into the dark corners of the room, rendering it entirely useless for illumination. To prepare for the application of this volatile material, the monk utilized a specialized tool known as a gilder S-tip, which was a flat broad brush made from the softest hairs of an island squirrel. Because the metal was too thin to be lifted, by mechanical grasping the monk achieved transport through the application of a subtle, natural phenomenon. He gently passed the squirrel hair brush through his own clean hair several times, a deliberate movement that generated a small amount of static electricity on the bristles. When the charged brush was brought within a millimeter of the gold leaf, the metal sheet responded to the invisible electrical pull, lifting smoothly from its parchment dividers and clinging to the hairs of the brush without sustaining any structural damage. The monk held his hand perfectly steady, hovering over the ivory surface of the vellum, where the intricate geometric outlines of the initial letters had already been scored into the skin. Using a sharp silver point, the successful adhesion of the fragile gold leaf to the vellum surface depended entirely upon the preparation of an intermediate layer called the gesso substrate, which provided both a adhesive foundation and a subtle three-dimensional depth to the illumination. The monk formulated this specialized compound by blending finely pulverized white alabaster gypsum with a light clear glue derived from boiling down the skin and cartilage of young freshwater eels common to them, caught in the island's seasonal streams. This particular animal glue was selected because it remained remarkably stable in high humidity environments and possessed a high degree of elasticity, preventing the gold from cracking when the book's heavy vellum pages were turned by future readers. To this mixture the monk added a minute fraction of red bolus, an iron-rich clay that gave the gesso a warm terracotta tint, which would later lend a deep classical resonance to the above it. Using an exceptionally fine brush made from the softest winter fur of a pine marten, the monk painted the strictly defined borders of the geometric diotmikinox, knots and divine, symbols that formed the foundation of the carpet page. He applied the gesso with painstaking care, ensuring that they formed a uniform slightly rounded cushion that sat approximately 0.5 millimeter above the flat plane of the vellum. This raised profile was a Kittler design aesthetic, as it allowed the finished gold to catch the flickering candlelight from multiple angles, simultaneously aesthetic, creating an illusion of shifting divine light that seemed to emanate from within the book itself. The monk monitored the drying process at absolute vigilance, waiting for the exact moment when the wet gloss state known as tack and the gesso entered a state where the surface was no longer liquid but retained a highly receptive sticky quality. If the gesso became too dry, the gold would fail to bond permanent air. If it remained too wet, the moisture would rise through the gold leaf. Clouding its brilliant surface with an irreversible dull grey haze. He leaned down, his eyes just inches from the page, tracking the chemical transition as the pale red shapes settled into their permanent configuration upon the ivory skin. The delicate transition from applying the adhesive gesso base to the physical placement of the gold leaf required the monk to master a unique physiological and physical technique that relied entirely on the warmth and moisture of his own body. The gesso substrate had now dried to a firm, stable state, but it required an immediate reactivation of its adhesive properties before it could permanently lock the gold leaf into its molecular structure. The monk accomplished this not by adding more wet liquid hat would distort the clean, crisp borders of the design, but by utilizing his own breath in a highly controlled manner. He leaned his head down until his lips were positioned a mere 2 inches above the vellum stream of warm, humid air directly onto the red clay compound. This specialized breathing technique, known as breathing the page, allowed the gentle moisture of his lungs to condense perfectly across the microscopic pores of the gesso, creating an instantaneous, invisible film of tackiness without oversaturating the underlying animal hide. Working with absolute speed before this microcondensation could evaporate into the chilly room air, the monk raised the gilder gold leaf, which held the electrostatic gold leaf, and lowered it with a perfectly vertical hand motion toward the prepared zone. The moment the gold leaf came into contact with the humidified gesso, it immediately released its hold on the squirrel hairs of the brush, leaping onto the sticky red substrate. As if drawn by a magnetic force, the metal sheet instantly flattened itself out, adhering to every microscopic contour of the raised geometric knotwork to ensure the metal made complete physical contact with every edge of the design. The monk picked up a small pristine ball of wool, which had been thoroughly degreased. He used this soft wool ball to press downward onto the gold surface, with a succession of incredibly gentle vertical stamping motions. He never rubbed the wool across the page, as any lateral friction would instantly tear the ultra-thin metal layer and create unsightly gouges that could not be easily repaired. Through this stamping process, the excess gold leaf that lay outside the boundaries of the gesso design began to fracture into minute shimmering particles, leaving the core design perfectly coated in a solid, unblemished layer of dull, raw gold that awaited the final intensive stage of burnishing. The monk sat back for a moment, allowing his breathing to return to a normal pace, while his eyes tracked the brilliant metallic shapes that now sat proudly upon the ancient ivory vellum. The raw gold leaf resting upon the terracotta gesso base initially possessed a flat matte texture that lacked the radiant mirrors-like quality defining the most luxurious pages of the Book of Kells. To transform this dull metallic coating into a brilliant sheet of reflective light, the monk engaged in a meticulous mechanical process known as burnishing, which required the use of a specialized tool tipped with a highly polished canine tooth of an adult grey wolf. This specific material was selected by generations of Insular. A wolf tooth possessed an extraordinary level of structural density and a naturally curved, non-porous surface that could be polished to an absolute smoothness using fine river silt and leather strops. The monk held the heavy ash wood handle of the burnisher firmly in his right hand at a strict 15-degree angle against the gilded surface of the vellum. Against the gilded surface of the vellis, he began to move the tool overlapping strokes, using short, highly firm but sensitive downward pressure that compressed the soft ductile atoms of the gold, went directly into the microscopic valleys of the underlying gesso substrate. This mechanical compression eliminated any remaining air pockets and altered the crystal orientation of the metal surface, forcing the gold to transition from a scattered, matte-like absorption to a state of perfect specular reflection. The monk performed this action with a rhythmic, deliberate cadence sound that produced a distinctive glided back and forth across the metallic boundary, as the polished pooth across the metallic boundary. He had to monitor the elasticity of the vellum constantly through the palm of his hand, sensing how the animal skin responded to the localized friction and heat generated by the burnisher. If he applied too much hat pressure in a single spot, the friction would tear the delicate vellum or cause the gesso base to fracture beneath the gold, destroying days of meticulous preparation. Conversely, if his touch was too light, the gold would fail to achieve its maximum density and would remain cloudy and unresponsive to the candlelight. As the burnishing progressed over several hours, began to shift into brilliant rivers of shimmering light that mirrored every movement of the tallow flame, reflecting a warm, undulating brilliance that gave the geometric knotwork an illusion of constant liquid movement within the dark stone chamber. The completion of the burnishing process marked a significant structural transition in the creation of the manuscript. There was shifting the monk's focus from the application of precious metals back to the intricate chemistry of mineral pigments. The next phase required the preparation of the brilliant green ink known as malachite green or verdigris, which would be used to fill the sprawling foliage and zoomorphic figures that wound their way around the newly burnished gold boundaries. Unlike the lapis lazuli, which was imported from distant eastern mountains, this vibrant green was dexters of corrosion through a carried-out controlled process of corrosion, carried out within the monastery itself, utilizing domestic materials available in the coastal environment. The monk reached beneath his heavy wooden workstation and retrieved a sealed earthenware jar that had been buried in a pit of fermenting organic compost for over 6 weeks. Inside this jar, thin sheets of pure hammered copper had been suspended directly over a bath of highly concentrated acidic vinegar derived from fermented wild blackberry juice and sour mountain ale. The chemical vapor of the acetic acid had slowly attacked the surface of the copper plates, causing a thick copper acetate crystals to bloom across the metal surfaces. As the monk carefully lifted the lid of the jar, a sharp, pungent, sour odor filled the tight space of the scriptorium, cutting through the heavy, greasy scent of the tallow candles and the earthy dampness of the peat wood floor. The monk utilized a flat bone spatula to gently scrape the soft pale green crystals from the copper plates into a shallow stone mortar crafted from fine-grained basalt. This raw verdigris pigment possessed a highly volatile chemical nature. If it were exposed to excessive moisture or mixed with incompatible binders, it would eventually turn a dull, acidic brown or eat away the very fibers of the vellum over the decades. To stabilize this aggressive green, the monk had to combine it with a unique organic tempering agent, made from the clarified sap of the native alder tree, which had been harvested during the winter solstice, when the tree's internal sugars were at their lowest concentration. Sitting motionless upon his wooden stool, his feet pressed firmly against the insulating block of peat to combat the freezing from the stone floor that rose continuously from stone, the monk began the slow process of grinding the green crystals. He could feel the gritty resistance of the copper acetate through the handle of his basalt pestle, hearing a soft rhythmic crunching sound that seemed to synchronize with the distant, heavy booming of the Atlantic waves crashing against the base of the cliffs below. His mind remained entirely focused on the physical feedback of the tools, adjusting the downward pressure of his hand by fractions of a millimeter to ensure the volatile crystals were reduced to an imperceptible dust. The silence of the room was a protective envelope, allowing him to detect the exact moment when the texture of the mineral powder shifted from a coarse sand into a silky, cohesive substance that would accept the liquid binder without clumping. He knew that this specific green required a high degree of flectible depth when layered next to next true optical gold, the brilliant reflective gold. If the pigment particles were ground too coarsely, they would block the light, appearing flat and chalky on the page. If ground too finely, the chemical structure would break down, causing the colour to lose its vibrant intensity. The monk added the alder sap drop by drop using a hollow bird quill, monitoring the viscosity of the emerald fluid as it pooled in the centre of the mortar, a vivid testament to the harmonious marriage of destructive chemical corrosion and creative human artistry. The stabilization of the copper-based green ink marked the completion of the primary colour palette, allowing the monk to finally begin the actual phase of ink application, known historically as the illumination proper. This process required a radical shift in the monk's spatial orientation and physical discipline, demanding that he sit in complete isolation for hours on end without altering the angle of his spine or the pressure of his forearm against the desk. The scriptorium Gurore kept perceptibly colder as the afternoon sun began its slow descent into the grey waters of the northern Atlantic, casting long, geometric shadows across the stone floor of the chamber. The monk wrapped his heavy wool cowl tightly around his shoulders, pinning the thick fabric with a simple iron brooch to ensure no loose threads would brush against the wet vellum surface. He pulled a fresh, unblemished sheet of prepared calf skin toward the center of his sloped walnut desk, weighting the four corners with smooth, heavy river stones to prevent the organic medium from curling, in response to the ambient moisture of the room. Before breathing life into the pigments, the monk had to establish the complex geometric matrix that underlay every square millimetre of the insular design. He retrieved his drawing instruments from a carved oak box, a pair of bronze dividers with fine needle-like tips, a straight edge made from seasoned whalebone, and a collection of dry lead points. To create the mesmerizing symmetry of the carpet page, he did not rely on freehand sketching. Instead, he initiated a sophisticated mathematical division of the space based on the principles of sacred geometry. He placed the point of the bronze dividers into the absolute center of the sheet, rotating the instrument with an incredibly light touch to score an invisible circle into the surface layer of the vellum. This central point served as the anchor for an intricate network of interlocking squares, triangles, and golden ratios that dictated the precise boundaries of every line, curve, and zoomorphic spiral that would follow. The physical exertion of setting these guidelines was intense, requiring the monk to lean over the desk until his chest almost touched the wooden rim, his eyes positioned mere inches from the ivory skin. He had to regulate his breathing with absolute precision, inhaling deeply and then holding his breath entirely at the exact moment the bronze tip scored the surface. A single tremor of his hand, caused by a sudden chill or an unregulated heartbeat, would create a double line or a gouge in the vellum, ruining the structural integrity of the layout before a single drop of paint had even been applied. He worked in complete silence, the only sound being the dry, scraping hiss of the metal point moving over the animal hide, a rhythmic friction that formed an intimate dialogue between the human mind and the natural materials. Once the geometric framework was fully established, the monk prepared to execute the first layers of outline using a highly specialized ink derived from the carbonized residue of burnt oak galls mixed with iron sulfate. This ink, known as iron gall ink, possessed a unique chemical property that allowed it to sink deep into the dermal layers of the vellum, turning a rich, indelible purple-black color as it oxidized with the air. The monk selected a pristine goose quill, which he had personally cured in hot sand and carved with a sharp penknife to create a split nib of absolute sharpness. He dipped the tip into the black ink, drawing it out slowly against the rim of the horn vial to remove any excess fluid. With his left hand holding a small bone utility knife to steady the skin, he lowered the quill vellum to the vellum, beginning the creation of a border that would eventually house the complex spiritual world of the book. The slow, methodical progression of the iron gall outline across the vellum skin brought the monk to the most challenging phase of the design, the execution of the dynamic zoomorphic figures that can the height of insular art. These patterns were not merely decorative fillers. They were a complex theological language, expressed through undulating lines that folded over and under one another in a continuous unbroken sequence. As the monk manipulated his goose quill, he had to maintain a dual cognitive focus, simultaneously calculating the three-dimensional overlapping structure of the ribbons, while ensuring that the physical flow of the black ink remained perfectly uniform across the changing texture of the calfskin. The vellum itself was not a passive surface. It possessed natural variations in density, with areas near the animal's spine absorbing fluid more rapidly than the denser flank section, requiring constant manual compensation in speed and downward pressure. To maintain the absolute accuracy of these interlocking lines, the monk applied a strict mental rule known as the law of alternating intersections. Every ribbon woven into the geometric matrix had to pass strictly over the first intersecting line, and directly under the second. There Kepite had no exceptions permitted throughout the entire tapestry of the page. The monk's eyes track the path of the quill with microscopic focus, his mind projecting the path of the ribbon several steps ahead of the actual ink deposit. He worked under the constant threat of visual fatigue, as the repeating parallel lines could easily create an optical illusion, causing the eye to lose its place within the dense field of ornamentation. To combat this physical strain, the monk periodically shifted his gaze away from the white vellum toward the dark, unreflective stone wall of the scriptorium, allowing his optic nerves to rest for a few moments in the dim shadows before returning to the grueling detail of the page. As the afternoon light faded into a deep slate-grey twilight, the temperature inside the stone cell dropped significantly, causing the viscosity of the iron gall ink to increase slightly within its horn receptacle. The liquid became sluggish, threatening to clog the split nib of the quill and cause jagged, uneven lines, rather than the smooth fluid sweeps required for the ribbons. The monk handled this environmental challenge by utilizing the warmth of his own body, placing the small horn inkwell directly against his bare skin beneath his heavy wool habit to keep the fluid at an optimal operating temperature. He cleaned the tip of the quill every few minutes using a damp piece of sea sponge, removing any dried carbon crusts that could a fraction of a millimeter. The discipline required for this work extended to the total suppression of involuntary physical movements. The monk's left hand remained anchored to the desk, holding the small bone knife with a steady grounding force that stabilized both the vellum and his own torso. He had trained his body to suppress the natural urge to blink or clear his throat during the execution of a long, continuous curve, waiting until the quill had naturally detached from the surface, before allowing his muscles to relax. The silence of the scriptorium was absolute, save for the rhythmic, dry scratching of the quill tip, a sound that resonated within the small stone vault like a physical manifestation of time being permanently recorded upon the ancient animal hide. The completion of the intricate black outlines laid the structural foundation for the introduction of the vibrant colour fields, beginning with the highly valued ultramarine blue that had been extracted from the lapis lazuli stone. The monk positioned the freshwater mussel shell containing the deep blue pigment directly in front of his workspace, using a tiny bone stick to gently stir the fluid and ensure that the heavy lazurite particles had not settled completely to the bottom of the organic egg yolk emulsion. Because ultramarine was an exceptionally dense and opaque pigment, it could not be applied in broad, sweeping watercolour washes. Instead, it had to be laid down, using a highly controlled miniature painting technique known as pooling or puddling, where the paint was floated onto the surface of the vellum, rather than rubbed into the fibres. The monk selected an exceptionally fine brush, crafted from the softest belly hairs of an island ermine, which had been bound tightly inside the hollow shaft of a crow feather, using fine silk thread. He dipped the absolute tip of the brush into the blue reservoir, picking up a single glistening bead of paint that hung, suspended from the delicate hairs, lowering his hand with a motion that was entirely driven by the pivot of his shoulder. Rather than the muscles of his wrist, he brought the bead into contact with the vellum, placing it precisely within the narrow channel formed by two parallel black ink lines. The paint immediately responded to the natural surface tension of the calfskin, flattening out into a smooth, brilliant pool that sat slightly proud of the surrounding surface. Working with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the monk used the very tip of the ermine brush to gently guide the edges of the blue pool toward the dark boundaries of the design, ensuring that the pigment covered the ivory vellum entirely without bleeding over the black lines, or leaving any microscopic gaps of white skin exposed. He had to maintain a constant awareness of the drying rate of the paint. If he worked too slowly, the edge of the pool connected it to the next bead, creating an unsightly dark seam that would ruin the uniform depth of the colour field. The damp air of the island scriptorium acted as a natural ally in this process, and giving the monk the precious seconds needed to achieve a perfectly seamless, velvety finish across the entire geometric panel. The optical effect of the ultramarine on the page was immediate and transformative, creating a profound visual contrast with the highly burnished gold leaf that sat adjacent to it, while the gold reflected the warm, flickering yellow light of the tallow candles outward into the room. The blue pigment seemed to absorb the light, drawing the viewer's eye inward into a deep, limitless space that simulated the infinite expanse of the night sky. The monk watched this interplay of light and shadow with a sense of quiet reverence, his mind fully detached from the physical discomfort of his freezing limbs and aching back, completely absorbed in the sacred task of translating the invisible architecture of heaven onto the physical plane of the manuscript. The completion of the deep ultramarine pooling established the tonal foundation of the illumination, creating a majestic tension between the infinite dark blue fields and the reflective brilliance of the burnished gold. With these two dominant structural elements firmly secured onto the vellum matrix, the monk prepared to introduce the volatile green pigment, the verdigris copper acetate compound, which had been stabilized using the winter sap of the native alder tree. This green was destined to fill the complex zoomorphic figures, the stylized elongated beasts and birds, whose continuous outer limbs and bodies formed the continuous outer borders of the carpet page, symbolizing the wild interconnected nature of the created universe under divine order. The monk approached this specific stage with a high level of physical caution, as raw copper verdigris possessed a distinctly toxic nature that could cause severe irritation to the eyes and skin if handled improperly. He adjusted his heavy wooden stool slightly closer to the source of light, taking care to ensure his hands were entirely dry, as any stray moisture reacting with the green ink could release localized acetic vapors that might soften the surrounding egg yolk binders. He selected a medium-sized brush, crafted from the fine, resilient winter bristles of an island marten, which offered the exact combination of flexibility and structural memory required to push the thick green fluid into the tight, restrictive angles of the zoomorphic knotwork, Musat's knotwork. Unlike the ultramarine, which sat proud of the vellum in thick, opaque pools, the verdigris ink had to be applied in multiple thin, translucent glazes to reveal its true internal depth. The monk dipped the tip of the marten brush into the emerald fluid, carefully moving the excess on a small touchata to the calfskin. Before touching the bristle to the calfskin tarns, he applied the green using a succession of short, sweeping linear strokes that followed the internal muscular grain of the animal skin. As the thin layer of green settled over the ivory vellum, it did not block the underlying geometry. Instead, it acted as a coloured filter, allowing the subtle, hand-scored lead points beneath to remain partially visible, giving the painted beasts an organic quality of light and structural anatomy. As he worked his way through the dense, repeating loops of the animal borders, the ambient conditions inside the stone scriptorium continued to shift, presenting an immediate danger to the stability of the medium. The sun had dipped fully beneath the western horizon, and the damp Atlantic night air began to surge through the narrow slit windows of the cell, carrying a high concentration of salt spray and heavy moisture. This sudden rise in atmospheric humidity threatened to slow the drying process of the alder-tempered verdigris, which could cause the green edges to bleed outward into the adjacent fields of black iron gall ink, resulting in a muddy, irreversible chemical smudge. To counteract this environmental threat, the monk utilized a traditional technique passed down by the master illuminators of Iona. He reached for a small heated stone tablet that had been warming near the scriptorium's central peat brazier. He held this warm, flat piece of soapstone approximately 3 inches above the wet green panels, moving his hand in a slow, continuous circular motion. The gentle, radiating dry heat emanating from the stone created a localized microclimate directly over the vellum page, accelerating the evaporation of the water content within the alder sap binder, and forcing their permanent crystalline matrix to lock into their permanent crystalline matrix before the salt-laden air could disrupt their chemical structure. The monk watched ver kepi te at intense concentration as the glossy wet sheen of the green porth slowly faded into a vibrant, uniform jade-like matte finish, signalling that the dangerous compound had safely bonded with the ancient skin. The successful locking of the volatile verdigris green completed the secondary tier of the coloration process, yet the illumination still required. Its final and most brilliant mineral component, the rich golden yellow pigment known as orpiment. This mineral, a natural arsenic trisulfide, had been obtained by the monastery through Unzov's trade network that originated in the volcanic regions of southern Europe. This, arriving at Skellig Michael in the form of heavy, crystalline yellow stones that emitted a faint, distinct odour of sulphur when broken apart. Because of its arsenic content, orpiment was notoriously toxic, a reality that the monk acknowledged by treating the pigment with a specialized set of safety protocols that had been developed over centuries of monastic workshop practice. This narrative is deeply inspired by the raw historical reality of 8th-century Irish monasticism on the isolated rock of Skellig Michael, meticulously reconstructed from the foundational texts of the Annals of Ulster and the structural traditions of Insular art. It reimagines the profound spiritual and physical sacrifice of an anonymous scribe, whose grueling devotion directly birthed masterpieces of human history like the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels. The monk began by donning a protective apron made from thick oil-cured seal hide, designed to prevent any dry mineral dust from settling onto his wool habit, where it could later be accidentally inhaled or ingested. He then retrieved his dedicated orpiment tools from a separate cedar box that was kept locked away from the general scriptorium. Instruments, a shallow mortar carved from ultra-dense obsidian, and a pestle made from the same volcanic glass. The extreme hardness and non-porous nature of obsidian were critical for this task, as any softer stone would absorb toxic arsenic powder of the toxic arsenic permanently contaminating the equipment for future use verkep tear-hat benign pigments like lapis lazuli or bone black. Working with deliberate, slowed movements to avoid kicking up any airborne dust within the tight stone chamber, the monk placed a few small chunks of raw yellow orpiment into the obsidian mortar. He did not grind the mineral with the forceful circular motions used for the green or blue. Instead, he used a direct, vertical crushing action, bringing the pestle down with a steady, calculated impact that shattered the crystalline structures into a fine, glittering sand. He had to be exceptionally careful to breathe only through his nose, directing his exhalations entirely away from the mortar to prevent any stray air currents from his the golden dust, into his immediate breathing zone. The sound of the glass pestle fracturing the arsenic crystals was sharp and metallic, to the soft organic scraping noises that usually filled the quiet scriptorium. Once the mineral had been reduced to a uniform, silky powder that shimmered with a brilliant sulphurous yellow intensity, the monk introduced the binding medium. For the orpiment he eschewed the standard egg yolk emulsion, as the sulphur within the arsenic would chemically react with the iron naturally present in ergot yolks, causing the brilliant yellow to rapidly oxidize and turn a dull, decayed brownish black over time. Instead, he utilized a specialized binder made from pure clarified gum arabic, the hardened sap of African acacia trees that had been imported via maritime trade routes. This plant-based gum provided a chemically inert envelope that insulated the arsenic trisulfide particles from an exceptional level of optical corrections, while offering an exceptional level of optical clarity that enhanced the natural light scattering brilliance of the yellow crystals. Using a split bird quill reserved exclusively for this toxic paint, the monk dipped the tip into the viscous yellow mixture, drawing it out with a steady hand to fill the dynamic geometric ribbons that served as the gold leaf panels and the green zoomorphic borders As the orpiment hit the vellum, its intense, almost luminous brightness brought an immediate sense of heat and vitality to the composition, acting as a visual bridge that unified the cold depth of the ultramarine and the acidic punch of the verdigris. The monk worked with absolute focus, his body frozen in a state of rigid mechanical discipline, as he guided the poisonous gold mimicking caul fluid along the microscopic channels of the ivory calfskin, fully aware that the beautiful substance he was applying to the sacred text carried the silent potential for physical death. The successful integration of the brilliant orpiment yellow brought the entire colour palette of the carpet page into a harmonious, high-contrast relationship, but it also introduced a sudden and critical structural problem that threatened to destroy the entire manuscript page. The vellum skin, which had been subjected to multiple and drying cycles as the monk applied successive layers of water-based egg emulsions, plant gums, and acidic inks, plant gums, began to exhibit localized structural distortion, known as cockling. Because that is an organic hydroreactive animal tissue, different areas of the skin unequal rates, expanded and contracted. At unequal, the dense flank sections under the heavy ultramarine pools retained moisture longer than the thin spine sections beneath the dry gold leaf, causing the borders of the page to warp upward into a series of sharp, undulating waves that pulled against the heavy river stones, holding corners down. The monk recognized this distortion as an immediate existential threat to the illumination. If the calfskin were allowed to remain in this warped, unstable configuration as it dried completely, the extreme tension would cause the brittle, burnished gold leaf to fracture along its crystalline boundaries and flake off the gesso base in large, unrecoverable sheets. Furthermore, the thick pooled layers of ultramarine would develop hairline stress fractures, turning into a powdery dust that would eventually rub off onto the facing page of text when the book was bound. The monk had to act immediately to relax the organic fibers of the skin without introducing any additional wet liquid that would dissolve the delicate water-soluble binders. He had just spent days applying. He reached beneath his workbench and retrieved his flattening apparatus, a pair of thick, perfectly flat platen boards carved from dense, quarter-sawn English oak that had been seasoned for over 30 years, to ensure they would never warp or leach natural tannins into the vellum. Between these oak platens, he placed several layers of dry, unbleached linen cloth that had been thoroughly boiled and beaten to remove any rough fibres or natural oils. The monk carefully unweighted the four corners of the distorted manuscript page, lifting the cold, stiff vellum vecepite at both hands, his fingers touching only the absolute edges of the outer margins, where no ink had been deposited. He placed the page face up onto the lower linen cushion, ensuring that every edge lay perfectly flat without any folds or wrinkles. He then laid a protective sheet of ultra-thin, smooth oiled sheepskin directly over the painted surface of the page. This non-porous barrier was critical. It prevented the wet ink pools from sticking to the upper linen cloth, while allowing the natural weight of the across to distribute pressure across both the raised gesso mounds and to distribute Jesper or flat colour fields. The monk lowered the heavy upper oak platen onto the assembly, taking care not to slide the vertica board laterally, which would smear the unstable orpiment lines, to generate the massive continuous mechanical pressure required to force the stubborn collagen fibres of the calf skin back into a permanent flat plane. He placed 4 massive blocks of dressed granite, each weighing over 20 pounds, directly onto the centre and corners of the upper platen assembly. He sat back in the darkening scriptorium, his breath emerging as pale plumes of white mist in the freezing night air, his hands buried deep within the sleeves of his heavy wool habit for warmth. The manuscript page would have to remain under this crushing weight for a minimum of 40 stone vault to allow the internal moisture content of the skin to equalize perfectly across its entire surface area. This period of forced physical inactivity was a regular trial for the monk, an exercise in profound spiritual patience that required him to completely detach his mind from the urge to see the final visual result of his labour, surrendering the fate of the sacred illumination entirely to the silent, invisible mechanics of pressure, time, and wood. The 48 hours of forced mechanical compression beneath the heavy oak platens and granite blocks passed in a state of rigorous monastic routine, during which the monk did not enter the scriptorium, allowing the internal microclimate of the pressed vellum assembly to stabilize completely without any thermal disturbance from his body heat or candles. When the required duration had elapsed, the monk returned to the stone chamber at the first break of dawn, his muscles stiff from the pre-dawn prayers and the unrelenting maritime chill that had settled over the island. He approached the workbench with a mixture of professional focus and spiritual anxiety, knowing that the structural survival of the entire illumination hung on whether the collagen fibres of the calfskin had successfully surrendered their tension to the steady weight of this seasoned English oak. He carefully removed the 4 heavy granite blocks one by one, setting them soundlessly onto the damp peat floor beneath the desk to prevent any sudden vibrations from travelling through the wood. He then lifted the top oak platen board with a perfectly vertical hand motion, ensuring there was no slight lateral slip that could catch the underlying layers. He peeled back the unbleached linen cloths and the ultra-thin oiled sheepskin barrier with an exceptionally slow rolling pull, his eyes tracking the surface of the page, millimetre by millimetre, as it was revealed to the morning light. The corrective treatment had been completely successful. The calfskin lay absolutely flat, as rigid and level as a pane of smooth river ice. Vecepite had no remaining trace of the dangerous undulating waves that had threatened to tear the design apart. The gold leaf sat perfectly secure upon its terracotta gesso cushions, its reflective sheen unblemished by hairline cracks, while the deep ultramarine pools and the translucent verdigris lines had dried into a solid integrated surface matrix that showed no signs of flaking or bleeding. However, this absolute flatness revealed a final, ultra-microscopic aesthetic requirement. The entire page now needed its structural highlights, acts, and fine white details, a process known as illuminating the shadows. This technique used a pure white ink derived from the processing of calcined sea snail shells, which provided an unmatched level of opaque brightness, capable of sitting cleanly over the top of the dark blue and green fields, to guide the viewer's eye through the dense geometric maze. The monk prepared this white highlight ink by taking the powdery calcium carbonate residue he had previously generated from burning the shells of local Atlantic whelks and mixing it with a very light, not diluted solution of clarified sturgeon glue. This specific animal binder was chosen because it possessed a neutral chemical structure that would not yellow with age, ensuring that the brilliant white lines would maintain their crystalline purity across centuries of exposure. He selected his most specialized drawing instrument, a micro quill carved from the primary flight feather of a woodcock, which possessed a naturally fine, flexible tip capable of depositing an ink line that was no wider than a single human hair. Leaning over the flat ivory expanse of the vellum, his left hand anchoring his chest against the edge of the walnut desk to eliminate even the sub-perceptible tremors of his heartbeat, the monk dipped the absolute tip of the woodcock quill into the milky white fluid. He began to apply a series of minute, repeating white dots and hairline strokes along the inner contours of the blue ribbons and the muscular segments of the green zoomorphic beasts. These white highlights acted as optical accelerators. By placing a bright opaque line directly adjacent to the dark iron gall outlines, he created a visual illusion of dramatic relief, making the painted shapes appear to lift off the flat surface of the page, and float in of his hand was mechanical layer of light. The rhythm of his hand was mechanical and unyielding, a succession of microscopic dots laid down with a spatial accuracy that transformed the static, mineral shapes into a vibrating tapestry of sacred architecture. The systematic application of the white calcium highlights transformed the flat, static fields of mineral color into a vibrating matrix of optical depth, but the monk's work on this extraordinary page was still far from complete. The layout now required the final integration of the primary text elements that would anchor the theological meaning of the illumination, specifically the great initial letters that commenced the sacred gospel passage. In the tradition of insular design, these letters were not mere typographical symbols, they were vast, architectural territory monuments that consumed the entire physical territory of the page, merging the human act of reading with the contemplative act of visual worship. The monk had to execute these letters using a highly permanent black ink made from pure lampblack carbon, which had been collected by suspending a cold bronze plate directly over the oily, smoky flame of an iron lamp fueled by purified seal blubber. The preparation of this carbon black ink was carried out with the same mechanical precision that governed every other aspect of the scriptorium. The monk used a flat horn scraper to remove the thick, velvety layer of oily carbon crust from the underside of the bronze plate, transferring the soot into a small, unglazed porcelain crucible. This raw lampblack possessed an intense, deep blackness that was entirely unreflective, making it the perfect visual counterweight to the brilliant gold leaf and the luminous orpiment yellow. To make this carbon soot mixable Verkepi Terhat water, the monk combined it with a unique wetting agent made from dried ox gall, a natural surfactant that broke down the greasy, hydrophobic surface tension of the seal fat carbon, allowing it to dissolve smoothly into a solution of clarified mountain honey and spring water. The resulting ink was incredibly rich, glossy and thick, possessing a fluid dynamics that differed substantially gall ink used for the initial outlines. The initial outlines. The carbon ink did not bite chemically into the dermal fibres of the vellum. Instead, it sat directly on top of the skin as a raised, three-dimensional ribbon of solid black carbon that required a completely different manner of quill manipulation. The monk selected a heavy, thick-walled quill obtained from the wing of a wild swan, which had been cured in hot sand for 3 months to harden the keratin shell until it achieved the structural resonance of thin horn. He carved the nib with a broad, flat chisel edge that was precisely 2 millimeters wide, designed to execute both the massive, commanding downstrokes and the hairline cross strokes characteristic of the insular half-uncial script. Sitting in absolute stillness, as the morning light fully illuminated the scriptorium, the monk positioned the swan quill at a strict 45-degree angle relative to the horizontal grid lines. He had previously scored into the vellum skin. He drew a deep breath, expanded his lungs to stabilize his diaphragm, and brought the broad chisel nib into contact with the ivory calfskin. He began to execute the massive vertical stem of the initial letter mort, moving his entire forearm in a slow, downward sweeping motion that used the weight of his upper body to maintain a perfectly uniform line width. The thick carbon ink flowed smoothly from the split nib, creating a rich, glossy channel of absolute blackness that seemed to slice through the surrounding fiordament like a physical blade of shadow. The monk had to monitor the distribution of the ink continuously through the tactile feedback of the quill tip, adjusting his downward pressure by fractions of an ounce as the swan feather crossed the invisible variations in the vellum S internal density. If he moved the pen too quickly, the thick ink would starve, leaving jagged loose gaps in the letter form. If he moved too slowly, the fluid would pool uncontrollably, creating an uneven bulge that would ruin the pristine geometry of the script. He executed each stroke with an unyielding, mechanical cadence that was completely detached from the physical fatigue creeping into his fingers and shoulders, his mind entirely integrated with the slow, deliberate birth of the sacred letter forms upon the ancient animal skin. The completion of the commanding carbon black stems of the initial letters established the definitive semantic structure of the page, but the monk now faced the delicate task of weaving these massive typographical monuments into the surrounding sea of geometric and zoomorphic ornamentation. The broad 2 millimeter lines of the swan quill had left a series of stark, heavy black forms that sat prominently upon the ivory calfskin. To soften this hard contrast and integrate the letters into the holistic design of the illumination, the monk had to execute an intricate decorative technique known historically as red dotting or rubrication. This process involved surrounding the outer profiles of the great initials with thousands of microscopic dots of bright red cinnabar ink, creating a vibrant optical halo that made the black letters appear to pulsate with an internal spiritual energy. The monk prepared his cinnabar ink using a rare naturally occurring mercuric sulfide mineral that had been collected from the deep mineral veins of the Central European mountains. This mineral arrived at the island monastery as dense, heavy chunks of a deep, liver-red colour that possessed a crystalline pulver structure highly resistant to manual pulverization. The monk placed the raw cinnabar into a small mortar made from ultra-hard white chalcedony, utilizing a pestle of the same material to systematically break down the mineral. He wore a damp linen cloth tied tightly over his mouth and nose during this process, as the dry dust of mercuric sulfide was highly toxic if inhaled, capable of inducing severe neurological tremors that would permanently destroy the absolute physical steadiness required for his profession. He ground the cinnabar for over 5 hours, the hard chalcedony surfaces emitting a low, rhythmic clicking sound that filled the freezing stone scriptorium. As the crystal size was reduced below the submicron level, the colour of the mineral underwent a dramatic optical transformation, shifting from a dull, dark red ebrellure into an incredibly brilliant, fiery scarlet that seemed to capture and amplify the weak morning light, filtering through the narrow window slit. To bind this heavy mercuric powder, the monk utilized a light, fluid vehicle made from the clarified white of a wild puffin-s egg, which had been beaten to a froth and allowed to settle for 24 hours until it formed a perfectly clear, non-greasy liquid known as glaire. Moreover, this protein-based binder offered a very low viscosity, allowing the heavy red particles to remain suspended without clumping, while ensuring the ink would flow smoothly from the absolute tip of the finest drawing instrument. The monk selected a specialized drawing tool for this tedious operation, a micro stylus crafted from a single long needle taken from the spine of a sea urchin, which had been mounted into a slender handle of elderwood using fine beeswax thread. The natural stone-like tip of the urchin's spine was perfectly round and non-porous, enabling it to pick up and deposit a single, uniform droplet of the scarlet cinnabar ink without scratching or scoring the delicate surface layer of the vellum's skin. Leaning forward until his eyes were positioned a mere 3 inches from the black border of the initial letter mort, the monk dipped the tip of the sea urchin stylus into the scarlet reservoir, pulling his arm tight against his ribs to isolate his hand from the internal vibrations of his chest. He began to apply the dots in a series of tightly packed parallel rows that followed the outer contour with mathematical precision. Each dot was placed exactly 0.5 millimeter away from its neighbour, creating a dense, dotted field that transitioned smoothly from a solid scarlet wall, indirectly adjacent to starry pattern as it moved outward into the blank ivory margins of the page, not scatins of the page. The monk worked with an unblinking, mechanical regularity, his hand moving up and down with the speed of a precision instrument. He had to calculate the volume of ink on the stylus continually, wiping the tip on a scrap of linen after every 20 dots to prevent the fluid and irregular blob that would mar the immaculate symmetry of the sacred citri in the Suridrid rubrication. The thousands of scarlet cinnabar dots executed by the sea urchin stylus transformed the perimeter of the initial letters into a vibrating optical haze, but the monk's journey through the manuscript's creation now faced a sudden and profound atmospheric crisis. As the sun reached its zenith, the typical maritime dampness of Skellig Michael was abruptly replaced by a rare freezing the Arctic north, blowing directly from the Arctic north windward. This environmental shift caused the relative humidity inside the stone scriptorium to plummet within an hour, a hazardous condition for a complex, multi-layered work of art where different materials were fighting for equilibrium on a sensitive, responsive organic base. The monk immediately felt the air tighten around his skin, but his primary concern was for the vellum sheet. Under the influence of this sudden dryness, the calfskin began to contract rapidly, shrinking along its natural collagen fibre paths, because the page was now covered in rigid, fixed structures, thick pools of ultramarine, heavy lines of raised carbon ink, and layers of metallic gold leaf bound to a brittle gesso base. The uneven contraction of the underlying skin created a severe structural shear stress. The monk heard a faint, terrifying, microscopic clicking sound coming from the surface of the page, a clear warning that the dry tension was beginning to pull the gesso base away from the vellum fibres. threatening to cause the gold leaf to fracture and shear off completely. To prevent this catastrophic delamination, the monk had to immediately reintroduce controlled moisture to the room, without allowing a single drop of soluble egg glare and gum Arabic binders glare. He rose from his stool, his joints aching from the prolonged cold, and walked to a small ware hearth pot for smouldering peat embers, and, with smouldering, he retrieved a bundle of fresh, green bladderwrack seaweed that he had gathered from the intertidal rocks earlier that week, which retained a high concentration of locked-in marine moisture within its thick gelatinous cellular walls. He placed the damp seaweed directly onto the warm peat embers, creating a thick, clean, cool vapour that carried a subtle trace of sea salt and organic iodine. The monk used a flat wooden board to gently fan this humid air across the interior of the scriptorium, carefully directing the invisible moisture currents toward his workbench. He did not allow the vapour to settle directly onto the page. Instead, he monitored the ambient air, waiting until the dry tightness in his throat-begown skin, waiting until the dry tightening secondary scratch began to ease, signalling that the relative humidity had returned to a safe, stable level. As the ambient moisture equalized, the monk returned to his stool and checked the page, using a highly polished rock crystal lens. The calfskin had relaxed under the gentle influence of the marine vapor, its collagen fibers expanding just enough to relieve the internal shear stress, without liquefying the delicate cinnabar dots or loosening the gold leaf. The monk let out a long, slow breath, his mind shifting from the emergency intervention back to the structural demands of the page, fully aware that every hour spent on this rocky outcrop was an unceasing negotiation between human artistic willpower and the volatile, unforgiving elements of the North Atlantic. The stabilization of the atmospheric crisis allowed the monk to turn his attention to the final decorative details of the carpet page, filling of the tiny interstitial spaces between the major geometric fields with a highly specialized pigment known as bone black. Throughout the previous stages of illumination, these microscopic triangular and curvilinear gaps had been left deliberately blank, exposing the raw ivory tone of the calfskin, to give the entire page a definitive sense of resolution, and to make the surrounding primary colours appear even more brilliant. These tiny voids had to be filled with a black that it would function as a visual vacuum, making the coloured shapes appear to float over an infinite abyss. Infinite abyss. The monk prepared this specific ink by selecting the dense, mineral-rich leg bones of a mature, red deer that had been found dead on the mainland during the previous autumn. He had broken the bones into small uniform fragments and placed them inside a tightly sealed earthenware crucible, which was then buried directly into the white-hot core of the monastery lime kiln. For over 20 hours, this process of anaerobic calcination, burning the organic material in the complete absence of oxygen, had completely removed the marrow and blue and proteins, leaving behind a pure, carbonized skeletal structure that was intensely black, incredibly dry, and completely free of any greasy oils that could interfere with the adhesion of the paint. I will come. The monk took these charred, brittle bone fragments and transferred them to a smooth porphyry grinding slab. He used a heavy muller made from the same hard volcanic stone to reduce the carbonized bone to an ultra-fine, microscopic dust, a process that required 3 hours of continuous, crushing manual labor. He could tell the fineness of the powder by watching how it adhered to the vertical surfaces of the stone muller. Stone. When the dust began to behave like a fluid, clinging to the porphyry through simple molecular attraction, without falling back onto the slab, it was ready to receive its binding medium. For this bone black, The monk chose a light, watery solution of clarified isinglass glue, which he had extracted by gently simmering the dried swim bladders of sturgeon caught in the deep waters of the bay. He selected a short, stiff brush made from the whiskers of a harbour seal, which provided the high lateral resistance needed to pack the thick, heavy carbon ink into the sharp, needle-like corners of the geometric borders. Leaning over the workbench, his right elbow resting securely on a padded wooden bridge that spanned the width of the desk without touching the wet cinnabar dots, the monk lowered the tip of the seal whisker brush to the page. He worked verkerb I te hat, a meticulous, stippling motion, pressing the black ink directly into the pores of the vellum rather than pulling it in long strokes, ensuring that the pigment completely saturated the grain of the skin. As the bone black dried, it achieved a completely non-reflective, velvety surface texture that absorbed almost 100% of the ambient light within the stone cell. The optical transformation of the page was startling. The adjacent fields of orpiment yellow and ultramarine blue, which had previously seemed to bleed slightly into the white margins, were now crisply defined by these deep pockets of absolute shadow. The entire composition gained a massive structural weight, the complex theological geometry standing out with a sharp, three-dimensional clarity that signaled the approaching completion of this monumental, months-long artistic sacrifice. With the absolute void of the bone black fully dried and stable, the monk reached the final crowning operational step of the carpet page illumination. The application of the microscopic metal rivets, known as the puncta gold dots. These were not flat painted accents, but raised, spherical beads of pure gold that were designed to sit at the exact geometric intersections of the zoomorphic knotwork, acting as physical anchors that lock the entire complex tapestry of lines into a unified theological statement. This process required a degree of microspatial precision that pushed the monk's physical endurance and visual acuity to their absolute biological limits, demanding that he work under the dimming light of a single tallow candle as the Atlantic night closed in completely. The monk prepared a highly specialized adhesive base for these raised dots, utilizing a recipe known only to the senior masters of the Insular tradition. He combined fine, aged slaked lime with a small quantity of pulverized white lead and a few drops of viscous unrefined linseed oil that had been cold-pressed from local flax seeds. This mixture formed a thick, pasty gesso that possessed an immense surface tension, allowing it to hold a perfect three-dimensional hemispherical shape without flattening out or slumping when applied to the vellum skin. To this paste, the monk added a tiny fraction of liquid honey, which acted as a natural humectant, keeping the core of the gesso microbead slightly flexible over the centuries so that it would never snap off during the future turning of the book's heavy pages. The monk selected an extraordinary tool for the placement of these gesso mounds, a single stiff whisker harvested from the snout of an island otter, which he had mounted into the hollow core of a small elderwood twig using melted pine resin. The otter whisker possessed a unique natural taper that ended in an absolute micropoint, while its structural keratin offered lateral stiffness and spring like recovery. The monk dipped the tip of this whisker into the white gesso paste, picking up an amount of material no larger than a grain of sand, and brought it toward the first intersecting node of the green verdigris ribbons. The leaning his chest hard against the walnut desk to completely damp out the macroscopic vibrations of his respiration. The monk waited for the natural pause between his heartbeats. At the exact split second of internal stillness, he touched the otter whisker to the vellum, lifting it away with a perfectly vertical snapping motion. The pasty gesso pulled upward into a tiny, perfect sphere that sat proudly on the skin, its diameter measuring less than 0.5 millimeter. He repeated this exhausting mechanical cycle hundreds of times across the page, his eyes straining through the flickering yellow candlelight to maintain an unyielding spatial of the underlayment that followed the sacred geometry of the underlying grid. Once the hundreds of gesso mounds had cured to a firm, rubbery consistency, the monk prepared the ultra-thin gold leaf scraps he had carefully saved from the initial gilding process. He used a tiny, flat camel hair brush that had been statically charged by rubbing it against his own wool sleeve to lift a microscopic square of gold leaf, placing it directly over the sticky surface of a single gesso bead. He then utilized a highly specialized burnisher made from the tiny curved incisor tooth of a wild field mouse, which had been mounted into a bone handle. With an incredibly light circular burnishing motion, he pressed the contours of the hemispherical gesso mound, shearing away the excess metal, until only a brilliant, spherical golden rivet remained. As the candlelight caught these raised points, they appeared to ignite, casting tiny needle-like reflections across the deep ultramarine fields, a final physical testament to the completion of the page S structural genesis. The completion of the golden puncta dots brought the grueling, months-long illumination of the carpet page to its formal conclusion, but the monk's labour on this specific gathering of the manuscript was not yet finished. The magnificent decorative gateway now needed to be physically linked to the continuous stream of the sacred text, requiring the monk to transition from the expansive or visual mindset of the illuminator to the rigid, linear discipline of the scribe. He turned the heavy, flat calfskin page over, exposing the pristine, unpainted reverse side of the vellum gathering, which had been meticulously scraped and pumised to accept the standard text of the Gospels. Before a single letter could be penned, the monk had to establish a flawless typographic grid that would ensure every line of script sat perfectly horizontal, with uniform margins and precise interlinear spacing across the entire leaf. He reached for his pricking tool, a small teedle-sharp point forged by the monastery, blacksmith, and a long, heavy ruler made from the seasoned jawbone of a pilot whale. Placing the whalebone ruler along the vertical outer edge of the vellum margin, the monk used his thumb to press the awl through this, precise half-inch intervals, leaving a vertical column of tiny, clean punctures that penetrated completely through the calfskin sheet. He repeated this pricking process on the inner margin, creating an identical column of twin punctures. These tiny holes were not structural flaws, they were the mathematical anchors for the ruling process. The monk then took his whalebone straight edge and aligned it horizontally between the corresponding punctures on the left and right margins. Using a hard lead point, a stylus made from an alloy of pure lead and tin, he drew a series of light silver-grey guidelines across the ivory expanse of the skin. He applied just enough downward pressures to score a shallow, physical furrow into the vellum-esque dermal layer without tearing the organic fibres, creating a subtle linear track that would guide the path of his quill. The creation of this ruling matrix required an immense amount of physical stamina, as the monk had to repeat the motion 44 times per page, his arm moving with the unyielding consistency of a mechanical loom. The constant, repetitive friction of the lead point against the rough grain of the calfsl filled rhythmic hissing sound with a dry rhythmic hissing sound. The monk worked with absolute concentration, knowing that if the ruler slipped by even a fraction of a millimeter, the resulting line of text would sag or crowd the margin a visual defect that would permanently mar the architectural harmony of the sacred book. Once the silver grid was fully established, the monk prepared his writing ink. Returning to the rich, purple-black iron gall mixture he had brewed from the tannin-rich growths of mainland oak trees, he selected a prime goose quill, which he had recut with a sharp penknife to create a medium-wide flat-nibbed edge suitable for the execution of the classic Insular half-uncial script, sitting upright on his wooden stool, his back straight and his left hand steadying the vellum with his small bone utility knife. The monk dipped the nib into the dark fluid. Heavy downstroke that marked the beginning of a new, unbroken line of spiritual transmission. The descent of the flat goose nib onto the silver guideline marked the monk's entry into a state of severe typographical repetition, a mechanical trance where the human hand functioned as a living printing press, centuries before the invention of movable type. The script chosen for the text was the majestic Insular half-uncial, a formal weighted by its wide circular letterforms, heavy vertical stems, and sweeping the walls and triangular serifs known as doghead terminals. Each letter was not written in a single fluid gesture. Rather, it was constructed through a series of discrete, highly calculated strokes executed in a strict, unvarying sequence that optimized the flow of the heavy iron gall ink. To execute the letter D, for instance, the monk performed 3 distinct movements. First, a short downward curving stroke to form the left side of the bow. Second, a matching curve to seal the loop on the right. And third, a powerful ascender that swept downward from degree angle at a fourth degree angle, terminating in a broad flat shelf. The monk's body became a rhythmic engine of execution. He coordinated his breathing to drop the nib on the intake of air, holding his breath completely as the slit of the quill opened under downward pressure to deliver the ink, and releasing it only when the tip lifted clean away from the vellum. The physical challenge of maintaining this level of typographic consistency across thousands of words was exacerbated by the biological nature of the medium. The vellum page was not uniform, as encountered the contrasting textures of the hair side and the flesh side of the original calf skin. Not quill, the hair side, where the epidermis had once held the animal's coat, was slightly rougher and more porous, offering high resistance and absorbing ink rapidly with a dry, scratching friction. The flesh side was smooth, oily, and dense, causing the nib to glide effortlessly, but requiring a much slower stroke speed to prevent the iron gall fluid from sliding or skipping across the surface layer. The monk handled these structural transitions by continuously modifying his grip and fine-tuning the chemical state of his tool. Every 3 lines, he used his sharp penknife to pare away a microscopic shaving the goose quill, keeping the split nib perfectly sharp, so that the thin, horizontal hairlines would never widen into clumsy smudges. The floor of his stone cell became littered with these tiny, pale quill translucent curls, silent markers of the physical erosions of the animal hide against the unyielding resilience of the animal hide. He worked without stopping as the pale morning sun climbed higher into the sky, filling line after line vercepti, his mind completely submerged in the cold. Silent discipline of the sacred text. The relentless, rhythmic progression of the Insular half-uncial script had filled more than 3/4 of the vellum page when the monk encountered a structural anomaly within the calfskin that demanded immediate modification of his scribe craft. As the goose quill approached the lower right quadrant of the layout, the nib scraped across a localized patch of scar tissue. A tough, fibrous nodule where the living animal had healed from a parasite bite months before it was slaughtered. This healed tissue was significantly denser and more hydrophobic than the surrounding healthy dermis that refused to absorb the water-based iron gall ink causing the dark fluid to pull back into tight beads rather than spreading into a flat, uniform stroke. The monk halted his hand instantly, the tip of the quill hovering less than a millimetre above the stubborn blemish, to force the ink to adhere to this vital section without compromising the immaculate symmetry of the sacred text. He had to perform an emergency abrasion treatment, known as tooth raising. He laid down his writing quill and reached for a small piece of natural scuttlefish bone, the chalky, porous internal shell of a marine cephalopod that had been washed ashore on the Island S rocky landing. Using the rough curved edge of the cuttlebone, the monk began to sand the localized scar tissue. Vekepate hatte exceptionally light, circular friction. He worked Vekepte at extreme care, his eyes tracking the micro-texture of the vellum under a polished rock crystal lens to ensure he did not upbraid the delicate sheet, that he punctured the delicate sheet. The friction of the cuttlebone generated a fine white collagen dust that smelled faintly of salt and ancient protein. This mechanical sanding action effectively sheared away the slick, oily surface layer of the scar, exposing the underlying microscopic bundle of dermal fibers that would mechanically trap the ink particles through simple capillary action. Once the surface texture was perfectly uniform, the monk blew the white dust away, using a dry swan feather duster to clear the workspace. Before resuming his transcription, he dipped his freshly sharpened quill back into the purple-black iron gall, checked the fluid alignment on a scrap piece of vellum, and brought the nib down directly over the treated scar tissue. The ink responded perfectly to the newly raised tooth of the skin, flowing smoothly from the split nib and bonding instantly with the abraded fibers, without any skipping or bleeding. The monk completed the remaining lines of the page with his characteristic mechanical cadence, his arm moving with an unyielding consistency, sapile that erased the boundary between the natural flaws of the animal hide and the structural perfection of the sacred word. As the final letter, a sweeping, elongated uncial met, Vekepayet anchored to the bottom silver guideline. The monk lifted his hand clean away from the desk, allowing the heavy iron gall ink to set into its permanent crystalline form within the quiet freezing sanctuary of the stone scriptorium. The settling of the final uncial character onto the bottom guideline brought a momentary stillness to the scriptorium, but the monk's labour on this gathering now entered its most vulnerable phase, the prolonged, natural curing of the iron gall ink. Unlike modern inks that dry instantly through chemical evaporation, required a slow atmospheric oxidation process to achieve its permanent, indelible state. As the ferrous sulfate reacted with the tannic acid of the oak galls and the oxygen in the air, it transformed from a translucent purple-grey fluid into a deep, velvety blue-black compound that physically bit into the dermal layers of the vellum skin, creating a permanent molecular bond. The monk carefully slid the completed leaf from the sloped desk, handling it exclusively by its wide, unwritten margins to avoid touching the wet, vulnerable lines of text. He placed the page onto a horizontal drying rack crafted from slender willow rods, which was suspended high up in the ceiling vault of the stone cell. This elevated position was strategic. It removed the wet vellum from the direct, freezing drafts flowing across the floor while placing it within the rising column of dry, warm air generated by the central peat brazier. The monk watched from below as the heat currents gently rippled the edges of the skin, a necessary process that allowed the ink to set without cracking the organic hide. During this mandatory 12-hour curing period, the monk was forced to maintain a state of physical vigilance as the volatile North Atlantic threat to his work continued to pose a silent threat to his work. The gentle heat from the brazier, while excellent for the ink, threatened to over-dry the vellum, if left unmonitored, which could cause the skin to shrink rapidly and pull the freshly written characters out of alignment. To balance the microclimate within the cell, the monk utilized a traditional technique. He placed a shallow clay dish filled with cold spring water directly adjacent to the drying rack. The water evaporated slowly into the rising heat, creating a localized envelope of humidity, and tempered the collagen fibers of the calfskin remained relaxed and flexible as the ink cured. As the night deepened, the monk sat silently on his wooden stool, his body wrapped tightly in his heavy wool habit, his eyes tracking the gradual color transition of the script. Under the steady influence of the oxygen and heat, the glossy wet sheen of the lines slowly faded into a rich matte absolute blackness that seemed to sink deep into the ivory grain of the skin, the chemical transformation cape complete. The acidic ink had successfully etched itself into the structural matrix of the vellum, creating a text that was completely impervious to water, scraping, or the simple erosion of time, ready to preserve the sacred words for a millennium within the cold heart of the monastery. With the iron gall text permanently cured into the matrix of the calfskin, the monk lowered the leaf from the willow drying rack to prepare it for the complex process of leaf conjugation and gathering alignment. In the architecture of an Insular manuscript, pages were not produced as single isolated sheets. They were created as large, bifoliate leaves, single continuous sheets of vellum folded in half to create 2 distinct leaves, or 4 separate pages of layout. To build a functional book, these bifolios had to be nested inside one another to form a structural unit known as a quire, or a mechanical assembly that required absolute mastery of material symmetry and grain orientation. The monk laid the large unfolded bifolio flat across the walnut workbench, utilizing a pair of long, polished bone folders to trace the central vertical axis where the sheet would be creased. Before making the physical fold, he had to carefully analyze the natural grain direction of the calfskin. Every skin possessed a distinct axial grain that ran parallel to the original animal's spine. Folding the vellum hat, this grain allowed the fibers to separate gently, creating a smooth, flexible spine that would open flat without resistance. Folding against the grain would force buckle and shear internally, creating an awkward, stiff bulge that would cause the finished book to spring open violently when placed on an altar. Having aligned the whalebone straight edge exactly parallel to the spinal grain of the calfskin, the monk drew the rounded tip of his bone folder down the center line with a firm, continuous pressure. This action did not cut the skin. Instead, it compressed the internal air pockets within the dermis, creating a permanent, indented track that relaxed the structural tension of the hide. He then carefully lifted the left half of the massive bifolio, folding it over to meet the right edge with absolute geometric precision. He ran the flat, broad side of the bone folder along the outside of the fold, pressing the crease until it achieved the razor-sharp, compact profile of a structural hinge. He then repeated this entire sequence with 3 other completed bifolios, creating a total of 4 nested sheets that formed an 8-leaf quire. As he nested the pages inside one another, the monk had to adhere to a strict aesthetic rule known as Gregory S. Law. Face to face, hair to hair. This principle dictated that when a reader turned a page of the finished manuscript, the rougher, yellowish hair side of one skin mer always face the hair side of the next, while the smooth, ivory flesh side must always face a flesh side. This ensured visual continuity across every open spread, preventing the jarring tonal contrast that would occur if a bright velvety flesh side were placed directly opposite a dark textured hair side. The assembly of the choir revealed an immediate mechanical problem known as creep. As the sheets were nested inside one another, the thickness of the vellum caused the margins of the innermost leaves to push outward, protruding past the edges of the outer sheets like a staggered staircase. This uneven edge disrupted the aerodynamic balance of the choir and left the inner margins vulnerable to fraying. The monk secured the nested assembly using a massive, wide-jawed wooden clamp made from dense ash wood, locking the 4B folios into a single rigid block, ready for the final edge squaring operation that would unify the gathering before it ever met the heavy leather binding cords. The clamping of the nested choir within the heavy ash wood vise, setting the stage for the placement caused by creep, setting the stage for the final edge squaring operation. The monk stood over the workbench, his left forearm resting heavily across the top of the wooden clamp to stabilize the assembly against the massive lateral forces required for the correction. The uneven, protruding margins of the innermost vellum leaves extended exactly 3 millimeters beyond the outer sheet, creating a staggered ridge of raw calfskin that had to be sheared away to form a single, perfectly uniform edge block. To achieve this level of structural precision, without fraying or tearing the compressed layers of vellum, the monk retrieved his specialized edge plane, a heavy, block-style drawing knife featuring a thick wedge of folded Damascus steel, forged specifically for the scriptorium finishing work. The blade had been honed on a progression of increasingly fine, oil-soaked river stones until its cutting edge achieved a microscopic sharpness, capable of cleaving through multiple layers of dense collagen fibers. Simultaneously, the monk checked the blade by casting a single tallow candle beam along its profile. Any reflective glint would reveal a microclean nick that would skip across the skin and ruin the clean margin. He positioned the chisel edge of the drawing knife flat against the true vertical face of the ash wood clamp, using the dense wood as a physical guide to dictate the path of the cut. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, he pulled the heavy blade toward his torso with a slow, continuous mechanical motion. The razor-sharp steel encountered the dense, laminated stack of calfskin with a sharp, dry crunching sound. Long, ribbon-like shavings of ivory-colored vellum curled away from the blade, smelling faintly of ancient lime and dried animal protein as they fell onto the slate floor of the cell. The monk had to maintain an absolutely constant angle of incidence throughout the entire length of the stroke. If he allowed the blade to tilt inward by even a fraction of a degree, the steel would gouge deeply into the margin, slicing away the scored silver guidelines and encroaching upon the outer columns of the written text. If he tilted it outward, the cut would bevel, leaving an uneven edge that would catch the air and gather dust when the book was closed. He executed the cut in 3 successive micro-thin passes, gradually reduction the protruding skin until the edges of all 4 bifolios were perfectly flush with one another. The solid, monolithic block of ivory skin that felt as smooth and uniform to the touch as a piece of planed boxwood. With the edge squaring complete, the monk carefully loosened the iron screws of the ash wood clamp and lifted the unified choir from the vise. He opened the gathering to its central spread, flipping through the leaves to to verify that the alignment remained flawless across every open face. The pages turned with a crisp, fluid motion, their edges completely square, and their text columns sitting in perfect mathematical harmony with the structural spine. The gathering was now ready for its final preparation, the piercing of sewing stations along the cant, creased fold, which would allow these individual sheets of sacred text to be permanently bound into the communal body of the great gospel book. The physical unification of the gathering edges marked the transition from individual leaves to a cohesive, functional codex structure, but the quire could not yet be integrated into the book's main spine without the execution of the sewing stations. This process required the monk to establish a series of highly precise structural channels along the heavy flax cords would weave, through which the heavy flax cords would weave. If these holes were pierced inaccurately, the tension of the binding threads would distribute unevenly across the vellum, causing the inner margins to buckle and warp every time the volume was handled. The monk laid the squared quire open to its central spread, anchoring the top and bottom edges with two small, flat bars of cast lead to prevent the nested bifolios from slipping laterally. He retrieved his sewing template, a narrow strip of seasoned ash wood into which 6-minute notches had been carved at mathematically calculated intervals. Placing this wooden template directly into the central valley of the fold, the monk used a fine charcoal point to mark the exact locations for the entry X and exit points of the binding needle. The spacing there caper et critical. The two outermost holes were positioned exactly one in from the top and bottom margins, to prevent the vellum from tearing under head tension, while the 4 internal stations were paired in 2-inch intervals, to align perfectly with the heavy leather split straps that would secure the book to its oak coverboards. To puncture the dense 8-layered stack of calfskin, the monk did not use a standard circular awl, which would simply punch a ragged hole by tearing the organic fibres apart. Instead, he selected a specialized 3-sided bodkin featuring a triangular diamond profile tip made of tempered iron. This tool functioned like a microscopic scalpel. As it was pressed into the crease, its 3 razor-sharp edges cleanly sliced the collagen bundles in a controlled, star-shaped geometry that would expand gently to accommodate the thick thread and then shrink back down around the cord to create a dust-tight, permanent seal. Leaning directly over the vertical axis of the crease, his body weight providing the necessary mechanical force, the monk brought the point of the bodkin down. Onto the first charcoal mark, he applied a steady downward pressure, accompanied by a slight quarter-turn twist of his wrist. The iron point pierced the layers with a distinct, muffled pop as it cleared the final outer sheet of vellum. He repeated this cycle for all 6 stations, his hand maintaining a perfectly vertical orientation to ensure the exit holes on the exterior spine of the quire matched the interior marks down to the fraction of a millimeter. Once the piercing was completed, the monk removed the lead weights and lifted the template, exposing the 6 clean triangular channels perforating the spine of the gathering. He ran his thumb along the exterior crease, verifying that the edges of the holes were crisp and free of loose, fibrous burrs that could catch or fray the thread during the sewing phase. The quire was now structurally prepared to receive its linen binding, a silent, mechanical framework of cord and knot that would transform these static fields of mineral colour and sacred text into a dynamic, living monument of faith. This is a work of creative historical narrative, constructed solely for entertainment, relaxation, and educational purposes. While rooted in verified archives, certain scenes and atmospheres have been textually reimagined to provide an immersive auditory experience. an immersive auditory experience. This content was developed with the assistance of advanced AI tools and has been meticulously reviewed, verified, and edited by the editorial team at Whispers of Centuries. All rights reserved. Until next time, listen closely to the whispers of the past, because you never know what timeless wisdom might quietly find its way into your night.